The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.
Good day and welcome to Clerical Conversations on the Crisis on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Nicholas Wanswetter, and I'm very happy to be joined and to be returning to the air again after our summer break with His Lordship, Bishop Daniel Dolan, pastor of St. Gertrude the Great Church in Westchester, Ohio, and by the assistant pastor of that same church, Father Anthony Cekada. So, my Lord and Father, it's great to be back on the air with both of you, and thank you for being on the show once again.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Nice to be back.
Clerical Conversations on the Crisis is a show where we discuss a variety of timely topics, news items sometimes, current events, or certain themes. We've done shows, for example, on annulments and the Catholic view of marriage. We've done a show on the Olympics and on sports and the Catholic views towards those. Today, what we're going to be doing is something of a summer news roundup, if you will, a number of things that have gone on over the summer that Bishop Dolan and Father Cekada would like to discuss, and we'll again look at these things from a Catholic perspective. And we've got a lot of really fascinating things to discuss. I'm really looking forward to the show. But before we get into that, my Lord, I wonder if I could ask you to lead us in a prayer to set the tone for our discussion.
I would be very happy to. Thank you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, whose providence in the ordering of all things never fails, we humbly beseech thee to put away from us all harmful things, and to give us those things which are profitable to us, through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Oh, thank you for that, my Lord. So to lead off into our discussion of the news events, I wonder if we could start, my Lord, with a bit of exposition on why it's proper or appropriate for clergy to be discussing these things, or for Catholics in general to be discussing them. A lot of people will sometimes object that the clergy shouldn't be getting involved in this sort of thing. They shouldn't be taking sides. They shouldn't be getting into politics. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why do a show like this.
Oh, well, thank you, Nicholas. Indeed, every now and again I can't bear it because I feel that we live in a world of 24/7 propaganda, and I'll print something in my bulletin or mention something in a sermon or even preach about some topic, and then someone will always come up with the old naturalist saw. The church should not be involved in politics. I was just reading this summer an interesting article on Don Bosco in that Latin Mass magazine, which for its editorial position and the rest of it still has a lot of interesting, edifying material. Don Bosco told his religious never be involved in politics, but then when you read a little bit more, you understand that of course he was involved in politics. He had to be. Everybody does in one sense or another. But I think I would make this distinction. I would say that we're not involved in attempting to take over a nation or attempting even to run a nation. Our goal is very modest. I would like our people to get some grasp of the objective truth, which I believe has not been is not provided to the people today by the media, and to see the truth in the light of Catholic truth. That's the kingship of Christ. That is to say, Catholic principles that are forgotten and need to be talked about. The principles of a just war or an unjust war. The Catholic principle of subsidiarity, for example. And then the common sense, maybe historical perspective. 100 years ago, World War I started. Aren't we in these great naturalistic empires that are battling with each other? Aren't we just repeating the same thing over and over again? The same, which always leads to the same carnage, same loss of lives, and destruction, and social disorder, and great offense to God. And talking about any of these things which always touch upon violence and war, I am mindful of the words of Our Lady at Fatima that wars are a punishment for sin. I think that if there's one Catholic comment, trenchant comment that applies to almost all of these things, it would be that truth. Wars are indeed a punishment for sin. So let's look at this. Let's try to see where the sin is, because that is our business, isn't it, to talk about sin.
Right.
And to this, I simply would add that the point that one tries to make from the pulpit all the time, not only for matters such as this, but for matters that are part of everyone's day-to-day life, things that they encounter every day, that we have to have the idea that we look at the events in our individual lives and in society, as it were, through the prism, through the eyeglasses, as it were, of the Catholic faith. And this is what is supposed to give us a proper perspective and allow us to see reality not as the world and as the secular mind sees it, but to see it in light of the faith and a little bit in the eye of God as well.
Then
I suppose it comes down to not compartmentalizing our life as well, and sectioning off the Catholicism. That's just for Sunday when we dress up nice and go to church, but the rest of the week, that's the real world reality, and that's separate from the nice stuff on Sunday.
And what is that if not? That's naturalism, and that's modernism, actually. And we have to be opposed to that with all of our might and all of our main. The idea that, it strikes me that the idea that there should be something, anything, on which the Church or Christ the King should have nothing to say, and we should just be quiet about it, is ludicrous, because if it's not under God, if it isn't for our Lord, then it's under the devil. Nothing is in practice, nothing is really neutral. It's either going to be good or it's going to be evil. And along these lines, maybe the first thing to talk about might be a little bit the classic approach of the Church in the United States in particular. And then I would talk about that for a moment, and maybe talk about the classic role of the dissident or the schismatic church in Russia, the so-called Orthodox Church, under the thumb of the czars, or later on of the communists, or now Putin, the temporal government. That's called the Caesaropapism, where the Caesar, he sits as the Pope, because someone's going to have the power after all, remember. I think that historically the American bishops just kept quiet. They not only kept quiet about things, but also they actively, to be accepted, to be part of things, they actively accepted all of the government propaganda and never raised their voice against it. So we're battling an over 200-year history of that kind of a supine, servile attitude, which on the part of a Catholic hierarchy, curiously enough, really does mirror the subservience of the schismatic state church in Russia. What we're doing really wants to get away from that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed, and this is something that you can see in the history of the United States, the history of law and constitutional law, especially in the United States. The reason that we have, say, an educational system such as we do now, where Catholics who want to have a Catholic education for their children derive no benefit at all from taxes or state money, is precisely because the hierarchy in the 19th century decided to be subservient and to go along with the prevailing naturalistic ideas. And we're still living with the effects of that now. The Catholics in the United States pay for the education of their children, if they want them to have a proper education, they end up paying 2 or 3 times with their property taxes, their other taxes to the state, and then actually having to pay tuition to support the Catholic schools. So we can see where the bad effects of this go along to get along. We can see how this played out in the long run.
And the go along to get along, it seems to me that plays into the compartmentalization as well, because part of that to get along was to section off the Catholicism. And John F. Kennedy's well-known speech comes to my mind, where he was ensuring people that his Catholic faith would have no impact upon the way that he'd govern the nation. He couldn't have been elected if he hadn't made that deal with the devil. But that thinking seems to have permeated American Catholic thought as well. And, in fairness, Canadian Catholics aren't really any different. But is it the same in Europe? Do you have any experience with that, Your Lordship or Father?
That's an interesting question. Well, look at the Church in France. The Church in France, for a long time, really until the reign of Leo XIII, was firmly opposed to the revolution, and then the hierarchy was divided. But at least there were some members of the hierarchy who opposed the liberal and the Masonic principles of the revolution, refused to go along with them. This is complicated with the condemnation of Action Française and the rise of the left wing. In effect, the left wing power in the hierarchy took over the church in France, they say, between World War I and World War II. And then it became just more and more liberal. What about Germany, Father? What would you say about that?
Well, it's from the knowledge of German history that I have. Because Germany was divided into small states before it was brought together one empire. You had different traditions, I suppose, in the Catholic parts of the country, where they tended to be more militant. But basically, what happened after the Second World War is most German Catholics, because the influence of the hierarchy started to go along with the liberal influence of politics and to make an accommodation with society. Now, the Germans particularly suffered from the effects of the war and turned, unfortunately, into very subservient people because of being conquered in the Second World War. So that naturally affected their mentality, and they wanted to become integrated, I guess, into modern liberal society.
And then even beforehand with Bismarck and the Kulturkampf, in general terms, the Austro-Hungarian Empire too, with Josephism, there was this idea of the all-powerful government that ruled and regulated the minutiae, the small detail of religious life, including preaching, sermons, and the education of priests. And so I think that the Germanic peoples were sort of preformed already in the way of what? Of submitting to the government. So I think we could fairly say that for centuries now, since before the French Revolution, even you have essentially you have a subservient church, you have a subservient national church, and very often because of politics, Rome herself would go along with many of these subservient policies, just trying to get the very best for souls, obviously, and feeling it necessary to compromise. Look at the suppression of the Jesuits, and this sets the tone, I think, for the world. Who's going to? The Pope spoke out. Saint Pius X died of grief 100 years ago, 3 weeks after the start of World War I, because he saw the futility of this war, and he saw how evil it would be. He saw all the horrible effects that would come as a result of World War I. And he very, very strongly spoke out and did his very best to try to prevent it. So I think maybe one of the things we could talk about today would be, are we sort of setting ourselves up for another world war? Are that same idea of empires in conflict? Are we actually seeing that today?
That's a good question. It seems to me, and perhaps you have some other views on it, but for quite a while now, the empires seem to prefer to fight their wars by proxy in smaller, a little more out-of-the-way locations, rather than having a full-on war between themselves. But then that way they can kind of keep a baseline of warfare simmering all the time, rather than some huge destructive thing that just annihilates everyone.
But in effect, especially because of propaganda value and money spent and lives lost, in effect, I think you can say that the West has now entered into the state of perpetual war. And perpetual war, we know from our fiction at least, that's what leads to the one world government more than anything else, the total manipulation of minds and the total destruction of souls.
Now, Lord, some listeners may be thinking, well, total, like, non-stop war, eternal war, what are you talking about? Some people I could get you to expand a little bit on what wars are we fighting right now?
If we go, we'd have to go back 100 years, right? So we have World War I, and all World War I did was to set the tone for World War II, and then the internal battles of socialism, National Socialism in Germany, international socialism in Russia, the Russian Revolution, the exporting of the Russian Revolution, then all the crisis of the 30s, World War II. Then after World War II comes the so-called Cold War, and these different sort of modified actions, as you say, through proxy fights in effect, or direct fights like the Korean War. And then that leads us into the Vietnam War and the continuation of this so-called Cold War. And the Cuban Revolution, the Communist Revolution there. Then you have the collapse of communism, and then the rise again of Russia, as it was 100 years ago, as a powerful empire, period. And then you have the whole Middle East question, how the United States goes in there, and by the stationing of troops. I think that was a big thing, the stationing of troops in what the Mohammedans considered to be a sacred land of Saudi Arabia, how that agitated so many of these of these sort of sleeper Mohammedans who, it was a quiet life and this wasn't going on. And then all of a sudden there are these terrorist movements, and then there's been a perpetual war in the Middle East really ever since maybe what the United States engineered in the 50s, the overthrow of the Mohammedan ruler of Iran, for example, to replace him with the Shah. So you have the United States really behind the scenes doing all of these things. You have Russia, too, behind the scenes, invading Afghanistan. There was a first battle there. And then you have to mention, too, the Zionist entity, the State of Israel, and that constant agitation and all the politics that are played there, and the horrible loss of lives this summer, the disgusting scene, for which Americans are paying with their tax dollars, of course. It is, I think you would fairly say, we have been for a century in a state of perpetual war, and that has bred the existence of a total propaganda atmosphere. Everything is propaganda. One political scientist defines propaganda as the management of collective attitudes and obviously control over opinion, how through the manipulation of significant symbols. And so symbols that should be dear to every citizen, for example, the flag, that might be a symbol. Now that's manipulated for something quite different, for somebody's political ends, someone's economic ends, probably, for the flattening and the destruction of culture in individual nations and societies, and to make everything the same and to make everything sort of westernized. I think that's probably part of it, too. It's a very frightening scene. It really is a punishment for sin.
And it's not like we weren't warned about this. Because people wrote even in the 19th century with the limited means of communication, then to the essentially newspapers and pamphlets about the dangers of war propaganda. And with the advance of technology and the spread of the ease with which ideas can now be spread, not just by paper media, but by the broadcast media, by the internet, and now the 24/7 news cycle, it becomes truly scary. But time and time again, we've been warned about perpetual war, about the manipulation of symbols, about mass manipulation of people's minds. But it seems that we don't learn the lesson. We don't learn really to see all these things for what they are, as a manipulation, first of all, simply from a human and political point of view. But again, for those of us who are privileged to have the Catholic faith, we don't often see it through the prism of the faith as we should, and we allow it to affect us.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's exactly. We do not see it through the prism of the faith. We act in practice as though there were great chunks, important parts of our lives that, as you said earlier, Nicholas, because of naturalism, that have nothing to do with the faith. It's a separate department. That can't be, because it has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with the devil. That's the simple truth of the matter. And then people end up being soulless and enslaved, and probably killed too, for that matter.
Well, it's a sobering thought to think that really the United States and her allies have been at war with someone constantly since before anyone on this show was born.
Yes,
and anyone listening to the show was born. And there's a few different trajectories that I could go with this. One that comes to mind when speaking about the abuse of symbols or the use of the American flag, couldn't it be said that really the American flag has been set up for that from the beginning, since right from the start, the United States lacking a state religion, they made the flag in America the state religion. And isn't that just automatically something to be very easily used and abused for these sorts of purposes? When you're,
I think there's something to that. I'm not sure that I buy it into 100%, but there's certainly something to that. And unfortunately, the American church, the clergy and the hierarchy, sort of fell over themselves from the very beginning to be the first to offer incense, to render this homage. It's a more complicated issue than that, probably. But the American flag does stand for this American empire, this imperium, in which we feel obliged to rule the world. Somebody, I just read this morning, some commentator remarked that, America has policed the world since 1945, but we can't continue to do that anymore with money borrowed from China and Japan. That's just the reality of things. So I think maybe this business about the symbolism, that falls under the category of, think about that. Study the issue a little bit. Maybe do a little research on it, and indeed pray over these things and try to know the history of your own nation before you maybe jump in to express too categorical an opinion about things.
I think the idea of the cultus, as it were, the cultivation of the American flag as a major symbol, really only began in the 20th century, in the sense that we know it. In fact, I don't think that the Star-Spangled Banner was even considered an official national anthem until some point in the 20th century. But I associate it with the expansion of the cultus of the American flag with the rise and effect of the modern mass media. one really started to hear about it and hear about its importance. Here, its so-called importance be emphasized.
Now, speaking of wars, Lord, you mentioned earlier the Catholic just war doctrine. I wonder, could you just talk about that briefly? What makes a war just? Because I know there's a lot of Catholics that would argue, well, the war in Afghanistan is completely just. We had to defend ourselves from maniacs flying planes into buildings. Or they'd say that the war in Iraq was completely just because we had to defend ourselves against them possibly acquiring, quote, weapons of mass destruction, unquote. So what is
when you hear idiocies like that, Nicholas, you just have to sort of shake your head and say, where do we even start? Well, but I guess we could start with St. Augustine, right, and Thomas Aquinas. And now Father Cekada is our present professor, so he's going to have to help me out here and fill in the picture.
Well, there are about 9 or 10 conditions.
There are 9 or 10 conditions, yes.
Yeah, and it's all very hemmed in, and all very very qualified. And there has to be, some sort of the notion of war is primarily something which is defensive. It's never and there has to be a just and proportionate cause for it. You can't harm non-combatants, and the idea that, in effect, what is an offensive war, such as, let us say, the invasion of Iraq, somehow could be turned into a just war from a moral point of view, is more than a stretch, is virtually impossible to fulfill the conditions. So you can't just simply because the President of the United States or the Congress declare it to be just, you can't take that at face value. You have to operate according to Catholic principles. And by the way, has to be a justly declared war. And that war was never declared according to the Constitution anyway.
Never. Most of these wars were never declared according to the American Constitution. But they're prima facie, they're unjust. The very face of it. Yeah, very face of it.
I wonder if I could ask maybe a little more personal question in regards to these topics, because both my Lord and Father, you grew up in a very different United States than the one now. How do you, aside from kind of, we've been speaking objective and more as pastoral and spiritual things, just on a personal level, how have these things affected you in your lives in the United States through the years?
Well, that's trouble. One gets used to living in a state of perpetual war, surrounded perpetually by propaganda. I'm conscious, especially as a priest, I'm conscious of that pull, the pull of the television set, the pull of the news coming all these different ways, every day of the week and all day long and all night long. And I worry about my people. I worry about the Catholic faithful throughout the world because of that, because of buying into all of these lies. A lie, if it's repeated and said boldly and no one objects to it, it serves as a key tool towards mass brainwashing. And that's in effect what we see. And you see that even with good people who then they have very little understanding of the great principles of the conflict of the day in the church because they've already been brainwashed. But just look at the whole exaltation of so-called democracy, which is just a lie. It's just a word. But they use it to justify all of these wars. And then, as we say, this whole idea of the separation of church and state, and that the church has nothing to say about certain subjects. Already you've got 2 or 3 major blows struck in favor of the devil's program for world subjection instead of the kingship of Christ. But it's the world in which we've grown up and the world in which we've lived. It's, of course, from a personal point of view, you think of your eyes being opened a little bit at a time. I remember Nixon and the Vietnam War, living through that era and understanding that was, I think that's when I understood for the first time the folly of these modern wars. Well, if they were going to fight to get rid of communism in North Vietnam, excellent, very good, but fight to win. And then you understand a little bit more history of World War II. World War II served to set up the communist subjugation of how many nations in Eastern Europe. That was the fruit of World War II. That the international socialists won, and the national socialists were subjected. So it's maybe a slow process. When you understand these things, and you see people mindlessly repeating what their minders, what their rulers want them to say, it's very troubling. Very troubling.
Father, what would you reflect on over the years, how it personally impacted you, the various changes in the...
Well, very much the same thing, because Bishop Dolan and I are contemporaries. We, even though we lived in different parts of the country, but lived through the same era. And you eventually come to the realization of this manipulation by the government to believe all of these crazy lies, and you're pounded all the time with this propaganda by the mass media. So you eventually, if you actually try to see these issues in the light of the Catholic faith, you eventually figure out that you are in fact being told lies that are intended to keep you quiet and intended to make you subservient to the state, those people who want to be our masters and who want to profit from it. So, but that takes you have to sit aside from that a little, or stand aside from that a little bit, and resolve not to immerse yourself in this type of propaganda, so that you can think independently as a Catholic is supposed to.
Do you think they'd be able to maintain these continuous wars if the wars were actually being fought on American soil, or is this an important aspect of these almost sanitized wars, where they fight them almost by the clicking of a mouse? A lot of it is drones and unmanned craft and things like that from a distance, but it's also being fought far away, so people can go through their day-to-day lives. They're not having to have their food rationed. They don't need to run into a bomb shelter at random times when bombers pass by overhead. Is that a factor in keeping this going?
Yeah, it's absolutely that's an excellent point, and it's a key factor in keeping it going. And remember, for a long time during the Vietnam War, for example, it was forbidden to show any realistic pictures on television, and particularly they were never allowed to show the pictures of the caskets of the dead soldiers being returned to the United States. And it's only fairly recently that something like that was allowed. And then but television, on the other hand, becomes such a propaganda means, just the internet in general, maybe today too, that it's very easy to shape that. But it's always at a reserve. It's always at a distance. You're quite right. Mm-hmm. We cause all of these people throughout the world to suffer enormously. Well, no wonder there's a wave. There should be a wave of resentment against America for what it's done, for all of this meddling and all these useless, wasted wars. How much suffering and it doesn't. You're right. It does not affect us directly, not at all. It does. It does if you have a relative, maybe who's gone crazy in Afghanistan, or who's committed suicide in Iraq, some poor soldier, or some woman who was deluded into joining the Air Force, and then she gets herself raped. You have to live with that trauma for the rest of your life. Well, sure, it does affect a lot of people, but that's all swept under the rug. It's talked about, but it's not. Everything is fine on the surface. It's the American consumerist way of life that goes on in all of these nations. We have caused all of this grief, and what a shame that is. What an injustice. What an offense against Almighty God and His laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you're correct in saying by conducting these wars at sort of the push of a button, you sanitize them and you put them at a distance. And, because of American know-how and technology, we're able to do that. And the effect of it is never really brought home. I think that when the government, when our masters would really have problems, would be if they tried to institute a universal draft for their perpetual wars. I think that they've been smart enough at this point to let technology and volunteers do the fighting. But I think that the political scene might change a little bit if the government actually tried to force our spoiled American youth to give up, in effect, a large chunk of their lives and go and risk them actually fighting a war.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think at this point the government is too smart to do it.
And so what they do is they appeal to the very, very poor people, the people with no education, and the people with no future. They appeal to them, and they think, well, this will give me an education. This may train me for a job. This gives me something to do for a few years, and some structure or meaning to my life. And then they join, and then they may come back maimed, or their bodies may return. And in any case, they come back imbued in that horrible war culture and a very, very liberal leftist culture. That is to say, no culture at all. And then, or also culture just of lies for fighting for the empire. How sad. There's a lot of injustice here.
Well, that makes me think of another interesting point. I mean, I would look at it, they almost prey upon people who are impoverished to get them into this. But where I wanted to go is, I don't know if this is the same in the United States, but certainly in Canada, it seems to me that young people have a more conservative mindset, if I can use that phrase. I mean, I know left and conservative don't really exist, but people who have a bit of a sense of patriotism, a little bit more old-fashioned way about them, they seem to be the ones that get sucked into the military too, because at least here, the Army has a somewhat traditional feel to it. I mean, you've got discipline, you've got uniforms. They're very big in the Canadian military on their regimental histories and traditions. So you draw in some of the better young people as well, and then, as you say, turn them into, I don't know what they turn them into, but imbuing them in this totally liberal system and the killing and the horrors, and just break them and chew them up and spit them out.
Well, wars are an instrument of social change. And so you look at the immense importance of World War I for social change, particularly World War II, the employment of women in the factories when the men were off dying in these wars in foreign countries. So the change that takes place here is that the Army maybe used to be, even though what they were actually fighting for was something that was highly debatable, but the Army used to be disciplined, as you say, as a place of order, as a place of patriotism. That's all gone now. It's a place of rank immorality. The very fact of the admission of women into the United States military, and all of the rapes that take place, and all the mixing of the sexes. If there were a Catholic Church with a voice anymore to condemn it, can you imagine how she would condemn this? The moral effect, it's a sewer. It's a sewer. And the fact that our young people would feel in the least attracted to join up, how sad. Say nothing of the whole confusion of the proper sex roles between a man and a woman. That's out the window. Social change, that's gone now. But just the real putting men in an occasion of sin, putting women into an occasion of sin, making women into fighters with rifles. It's to fight some corporation's idea of a war, Halliburton and Iraq, for example. Oh my goodness. We really can't condemn these things strongly enough, but we condemn them according to Catholic principle. And we condemn them according to, we hope, some sense of objective truth that we can eke out from the media. One of the things that I thought might be along those lines, might be helpful, is for some of the current events that have taken place this summer, that we're talking about this today in this show, to talk about how, in effect, the old American thing would apply to us, we don't have a dog in that fight. So if you look at Israel, the versus Hamas in Gaza, or if you look at the American empire versus the Russian empire, and the showdown over Ukraine, or if you look at domestic affairs, the crisis of yet some other black youth in the process of committing different crimes that day, being slain by the police, and then all the rioting afterwards, and then the militarized, the soldierized police force of the United States today coming in. When you just to examine those situations alone, you look at both sides and you say, it's all wrong. Everything is wrong. Everything is wrong. And the thought that there's going to be a conservative, quote unquote, position that we're going to take on these things and get ourselves all riled up, no, I don't think so. We regret very much. Go ahead, Bill.
If you take those three things, Your Excellency, one by one, if you take, for instance, the question of Israel versus Hamas, pox on both their houses, we shouldn't support either of them.
No.
There is no moral justification for us supporting these wars, yet we do get involved. The Israelis are able to slay Muslims in their unjust war because we provide them with an awful lot of money. The American government does, which subsidizes their military. One thing that I noticed in the latest Israel versus Hamas crisis was that it was something that was buried in the paper. And the inside that at a certain point, Israel ran out of ammunition. And the American government then had to scramble to get them more rockets, and more artillery, and more ammunition to pound Hamas. Now, there's no moral justification for us to do that. No reason. We don't really have a dog in the fight. Who cares? No. Really, it doesn't affect our national standing or national policy. On the natural level, and certainly on the supernatural level, it's wrong to support an unjust war like that. So if you take that Israel versus Hamas, one element in the war and the propaganda for perpetual war, and then the second thing you mentioned is Ukraine versus Russia. I feel sorry for people on both sides.
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean that we should pick a side as Americans or as Canadians, as citizens of other countries, and get involved in the fight between these two people. In effect, now it's turned into a war between two empires, between America and the West and Putin's empire in Russia.
Mm-hmm. So we're conscious of how much damage the American empire has done, particularly from a cultural or spiritual level, by bringing all the filth of the West, entertainment and consumerism, to these places that still had some of a natural life and even a supernatural life in their families and their culture. But on the other hand, I think if you're talking about Ukraine, you also have to be conscious of the fact that how many times has Russia in the 20th century attempted a genocide in Ukraine by the starvation programs of Stalin in the 1930s, and then spiritual genocide, his attempt, the attempt of the communists utterly to destroy the Ukrainian Catholic Church, or the Greek Catholic Church as they call it there, the Eastern rites in union with Rome, and all that bitter persecution. And so much of that is just, of course, it's just the empire. It's the Russians versus the Ukrainians wanting to make the Ukrainians to submit to them because they are considered to be an inferior people, the same way that the Russians historically treated the Poles for so very long, making them to submit. So you look at these things, and then you look at all the lies being told on both sides, and to try to get some sense of reality, you only feel, as Father says, a sense of great sorrow and pity, a great sympathy and empathy for the poor people that are caught in the warfare. And I think we have to feel that way and pray that way for all of these people throughout the world who are caught in the fire. They're just used because they're nothing. They mean nothing to these people because they don't believe in God, and they don't believe in mortal soul, or our masters, the one who run all of these things. So what a terrible tragedy. Then the third thing would be the whole question of the blacks, the poor blacks, and this whole Ferguson business and the rioting, and the role that the United States government, under the guise of being kind or merciful, has played in all the Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. But actually, they say it started with Roosevelt during the era of the Depression, Second World War. In effect, the payment of money, which leads to the justification and the survival of a matriarchy. So there are no men around anymore. Women don't have to be married. There's no role for a husband. The government pays women. This is obviously a simplification, but that's in effect what happens. And that's gone on for generation after generation now. So you have this horribly lopsided and unnatural society that's been, by government money, in effect, promoted or foisted on the Negro or the black community in America. Then these things come as a result of it. But then on the other hand, you have police who've been militarized to an astounding degree. I think it's one of the 9/11 after factors, and they come in and woe betide you if you, in the very least, question anything that they're going to do, because they are meant indeed to be all powerful. Once again, where's our dog here? I don't know who we're going to be backing on this. We will be backing Catholic truth. We'll be backing sane principles of social life that the Catholic Church has always taught and proposed.
So you get in if we pivot now, as it were, a little bit to the whole domestic issue, the relationship between international wars, as it were, between empires, and the conflict within society that's stirred up and, in effect, promoted by the government to maintain control. You see that very much in the false racial war and conflict that's been constructed in the United States. And we've had for how many weeks now a constant stream of propaganda discussion about the situation down in Missouri and Ferguson. This conflict there supposedly between the blacks who were told are oppressed and persecuted, and the militarized police, and then the federal government getting involved to promote further conflict by maintaining there were some sort of civil rights violations. So it's this constant agitation. And by maintaining this is a way of distracting people and maintaining control.
Yes, that's it. And so everything in life today is all squeezed into a Hegelian dialectic, right? What Ratzinger did and the modernists have done to the Catholic Church, our masters do in society, government, wars, everything. It's all. There's always a conflict. The conflict is perhaps is set up secretly, is secretly funded, and then is agitated by means of the propaganda of the media today. And so there's a thesis, and then there's an antithesis, and let them go, let them at it, let them fight, because out of this will come the synthesis that they're looking for, the bad guys, whether it be in state or whether it be in church. That's what they're ultimately after. The poor and the poor deluded souls who listen to and buy into this propaganda sell their souls, in effect. And how sad that is, because Scripture says, "Is there no balm in Gilead?" Indeed, there is, and that's the balm that comes of the Holy Ghost. That's the truth. The Catholic Church has the truth. She has the principles. And thank God the voice of the church has not been entirely stilled. There are still at least some priests and bishops who will proclaim this truth. But so many, even Catholics, have just bought into all of these lies because that's all they knew. They've lived with this, and they've never had the principles explained to them.
Right. Yeah, and the wars, both external and internal, are doing that social shaping that you spoke of earlier, my lord. And I mean, there's just so much we can talk about in here, but one thing I'd like to ask you both about, just zooming in a little bit on the Ferguson situation. It's been about a month now that things have been going on there. It was August the 9th, and just for any listeners that aren't totally familiar with that situation, August the 9th, I mentioned as the flashpoint, there was a young man, Michael Brown, I believe his name was, apparently did a pretty brutal robbery of a box of cigars from a store, and was then encountered a police officer on the street. And there's conflicting reports on what exactly happened, but he ended up being...
Excuse me, but it was because he was boldly walking down the middle of the street. That's what drew the attention of the police officer, who told him, get out of the street, walk on the sidewalk. And then there was that led to some sort of a conflict, Nicholas, I think.
Right. And that's an important point, Lord. Thank you for reminding me of that. And anyway, some people say this officer shot him in cold blood. Some would say that he charged the officer. I don't know that it matters a lot for our purposes of what exactly happened. I mean, that's something to be sorted out by the courts, I would think. And we weren't there. But what has happened since then is they've been using this for. There's been all kinds of riots in this town and, or I guess, small city. But I think it's interesting, the propaganda, the social engineering, the indoctrination through the public education system, that the black people who are being stirred up against the police on this issue, they're really being used as pawns, I think, to foment class warfare, race hatred, an us versus them mentality, which then leads to almost a constant warfare within the society. And I think that's what allows, then they need to justify, well, they're having riots, so now we need to bring in police with tanks, and we need to develop space-age supersonic sound weapons that'll stop people from rioting and all kinds of crazy things that
and then more spying,
heat guns.
Domestic spying on the citizens as well, and ultimately that means that Congress has to pass more laws, because if only we had enough laws, of course, we would live in a perfect society. You see, and these are not accidental. That's the point. They're all intended. All of these things, they're happening on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, right. I guess you could say the realization of Leon Trotsky's idea of the perpetual revolution. You have this constant revolution, and then you end up with this control. Because the black people in the United States, as a result of the Roosevelt and the welfare state, end up being the clients of the government.
Yeah,
and this offers the government an opportunity and an excuse to impose social control. And this is exactly what they do by the passing of more laws, by more investigations and accusations, and then eventually the supremacy of the government in every aspect of everyone's life. And so this is I see at least, certainly in Ferguson, just another stage where this is taking place.
Mm-hmm. And of course, they always point out this thing, if only we had more laws, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
And always pointing to the state as the solution, when, again, going back to we don't have a dog in this fight. We don't support the robber or the militarized police.
Exactly.
The solution isn't more laws. The solution is getting back to Christ and
renewing
and that's the
things
message.
that's the message that Restoration Radio is trying to get out, and in fact, on a worldwide level. That's the message that I try to get out in my own parish here in Westchester, Ohio, Father Cekada by his blogs and his work. And it's sort of English in a sense, and I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek, but, keep calm and do your duty, sort of a thing. But there's great wisdom in that. Have a cup of tea here, turn off the television set and turn off the wireless, and keep calm. But they want us to be in they want a perpetual state of war within, Nicholas. I believe that's the ultimate goal. Peace is the fruit of order and of justice. They want to take away those virtues or that fruit of the Holy Ghost. They want to replace with constant agitation, because that's where the devil does his best work, is when a soul is agitated. So when you realize, wait a minute, these are all just lies anyways. It's a mass manipulation leading to mass mind control, brainwashing. Maybe I would turn these things off. Maybe I'll read some good articles. Maybe actually I'll read some classics. Maybe I'll play chess. Maybe I'll go out and I'll work in the garden. That would be a very good maybe. That would be a good response to the insanity of this summer's news.
Right. Now, I think that's another important point you raised, is not to lead to take this to despair. Some people, they'll despair over this and think, oh, the world's just too crazy. It's all going to end soon,
And how, yes, that's true. And how agitated people end up. But again, particularly those who live by the sword will die by the sword, our Savior said. And it's death for people if they live by the media. They're constantly, everything is jittery, and you're watching that phone, and the phone lights up at night, and you've got to reach for it and see what the latest message is. No, you have to be calm. You have to be a little bit detached, or you have to reattach yourself to prayer. You have to meditate. You should pray the rosary and meditate those mysteries. Read the Mass of the day. Say your devotions. Keep a balanced life. They want to rob us of all of this, because I think I'd like to repeat it. The goal of perpetual war is not only perpetual war in Iraq or the Middle East or Ukraine. It's perpetual war in society and perpetual war in the soul, in the mind, in the individual. And we have to opt out of that. We truly do.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me it's quite masterful the way they do it, though, because the two sides of these conflicts always seem to, I guess it would seem that people have a natural tendency or a natural desire to have a good guy and have a side that they can support, but they present to us impossible choices, or sides where both guys are bad. I mean, again, Ferguson, we look, some people think, well, I don't want to be taking the side of a robber, so I guess that means then I have to side with the police. They need to stop these riots. They need to maintain law and order. So if they zap some people with a microwave gun to make them stop rioting, then I guess that's what they need to do. Or same with Israel and Palestine, or going back to World War II. I think World War II is the example par excellence of that. It's presented as this good versus evil struggle. And you're presented with, as you say, international socialists on one hand and national socialists on the other hand. And so they end up co-opting everyone, because if people end up choosing a side rather than just sticking with Catholicism and realizing that they don't have a dog in these fights, then that's how they get the hook into people, I think.
They do, and they look at World War One and all the. Look at England, World War One. Say that entire generation that was just wasted for nothing. They whipped up the government propaganda to make the Germans into the Huns, and then the Germans, in a certain sense, did their best to live up to the expectations, but not really. They weren't barbarians. They weren't at all. It's perfidious Albion. They were the barbarians in so many ways. And you look at the real history, look at the individuals, the movers and the shakers of again World War One, and the enormous waste and the tragedy of it. Well, this is what we bring to the table, I think, Nicholas. This is what we have to offer. Stop. read, study, pray, look at this stuff. Don't make a knee-jerk reaction because the propaganda masters want to pull your strings. You're not a puppet. You're an immortal. You have an immortal soul. You have reason. You're a human being. You should live acknowledge thy dignity, O Christian. I think we're crying out for this.
Now, I don't want to get too much into the tall grass, but something interesting popped in my mind, Lord, as you're talking about the utter destruction of Europe in World War I, and then kind of the 1-2 punch followed up with even worse destruction in World War II. Did that help pave the way or weaken resistance to Vatican II and its reforms, quote, reforms, unquote? Do you think that would be a valid observation or supposition to make, that that was part of the plan, that people were just so desolate and beaten down from these horrific wars, and a lot of their best and brightest have been wiped out, that weakened the immune system a little bit?
Absolutely, directly and indirectly. From everything from these great societal changes, we're talking about the role of women or the stability or the lack thereof in the family as a unit of society, all the way to, I'll give you a practical American example, ecumenism. One of the great seeds of ecumenism was planted amongst the chaplains of World War II, which was entirely understandable. So they're not bad fellows, and I can conduct a service for them too, or they could conduct a service for me, that practical cooperation. And you have your beliefs and I have mine, and we just respect each other. And I would be horrified at the idea of condemning your beliefs as entirely false and leading people to hell. I would never do that. You're my bud. You're my friend. We're fighting together for the great ideals of American democracy. In Europe, particularly, I think Father Cekada knows more about this than I do, but the liturgical movement got such a boost, shot in the arm, because of the wars, right, Father?
Yeah, because it was a situation, naturally, the time of war is a time of confusion, and those who wanted to push forward the liturgical revolution, certainly in the church, profited from the unsettled conditions to push their agenda forward. And in the time after the war, certainly the confusion, the destruction of institutions, the change of personnel, and so on, the liturgical movement also profited from this very much to put their agenda forward. So it's you build revolutions on wars.
Well, we're just at the top of the hour here. So you're listening to Clerical Conversations on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Nicholas Wansbutter, and I'm joined by His Lordship, Bishop Daniel Dolan and Father Anthony Cekada. And today we've been discussing all kinds of things, going through some recent events in the news over the summer and talking about Catholic principles on various topics. And we just want to remind you that Clerical Conversations on the Crisis is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. Permission can usually very easily be obtained by writing to mail@truerestoration.org. So that little show bumper out of the way, if you don't mind, Lord and Father, I'd like to go back a little bit to Russia, because I think this follows on the point I was raising about how you often have both sides are problematic, and in the propaganda they'll try to idealize one side or the other to try to draw people into supporting one side. And I think, Lord, your point was excellent earlier in the show, where you say you need to go back to World War I and World War II when you're looking at the continual wars we've been in. And I think a lot of people's worldview and mindset is perhaps subconsciously quite shaped by their view of World War I and World War II as these great clashes of good versus evil, and especially World War II, which really helped, as we've discussed, institute the modern world as we know it. But when you look at the winners as the good guys, then what we're in must be good. But on Russia, That's an interesting topic to me. And Father Cekada sent a bunch of articles to me that I read in preparation for the show. And there's some fascinating things in there. And again, a lot of people, I think, are tempted to think of, they were probably raised thinking of Russia as the evil empire if you grew up during the Cold War. And so they must be the bad guys here. And because they're bad guys, we should be bringing Ukraine into NATO, and we should be going into all kinds of war with Russia. But one of the articles Father pointed out, I thought this was a really interesting thought exercise that it offered for people, is think about what if, just to put the background for what's going on in Russia, if some listeners don't know, is essentially there was a more pro-Russian government under Viktor Yanukovych, which was in power in Ukraine. He was effectively, it was almost a coup, really, that kicked him out of office. And then a new government came in that's much more pro-Western, and they're the ones trying to get into European Union, trying to get into NATO. And they were passing some laws that were of great concern to the parts of Ukraine that are heavily populated by Russians. As people may or may not know, Ukraine only became a country after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Before that, Western Ukraine was part of Poland for centuries, and Eastern Ukraine is part of Russia. So there's lots of Russians living in the eastern part of Ukraine. So some of them wanted to secede. I think Crimea had a referendum, and the people voted that they wanted to leave the Ukraine and join Russia. And then now there's fighting because the Ukrainian government is crushing these, quote, rebels, unquote, and then it's unclear whether the Russians are just allowing volunteers to go into the country or whether they've actually sent their own military in there. But I think an interesting way of looking at it is to consider, well, what if the Russians propped up some anti-American, pro-Russian government in Mexico, and that government then started passing a bunch of laws against, if there were some pro-American sentiments in northern parts of Mexico, and were going after the Americans there, and then they were wanting to split and join the U.S., and the Mexican army was then killing American civilians and pro-American people. The American public would be howling for Mexican blood. They'd be demanding that American troops march on Mexico City.
Sure. Well, Nicholas, what you've given us is actually a thumbnail sketch of American-Mexican relations during the 19th century. Yeah. Almost everything that you've just said actually happened. Everything. And that's a very interesting historical perspective. If it were to go on, say again today, if that were to resume, how would we feel about those things? So, because America is, of course, it's an empire, and it wants to secure its borders. It wants friendly countries on each side of it. That's why there was a great to-do about Cuba, little tiny Cuba, because it was a communist bastion, Soviet bastion against 90 miles from Florida, and that was an understandable thing. So, of course, for Putin, the Russian Empire, naturally, this is their sphere of influence.
You can have democracy only if it results in a government that our empire likes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Otherwise, you're not allowed to have a vote. You can't do that. Yeah. This is all
the ironic thing about not ironic, but hypocritical thing about the America's conduct when it comes to Ukraine is that actually Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president, was democratically elected according to their constitution. We supposedly have the great ideal of democracy. And he was chased out of office, in effect, by a coup d'etat and pressured to leave. The pro-Russian president of Ukraine.
The Americans had a big role in that.
Yes, they did.
Directly and indirectly. Yes. Then our Ukrainian priest, Father Valery, is a Greek Catholic priest, who lived in Russian Ukraine, right near the Russian border, actually, and he and his family had to flee because it's gone now. It's all bombed and destroyed and taken over, and so much bloodshed. But he reports, of course, that the original Yanukovych government was corrupt itself and utterly inept, as so many governments tend to be, and so there truly is almost a sort of sense of hopelessness. So the American empire is dangling out all of these economic advantages, and the glory of the world, and a real temptation to the Ukrainians to side with us, and you'll get all this stuff. And the Russians, they are at least appealing to some natural values, patriotism, but also morality that the West has trampled upon and rejected now. It makes it to be a very complicated situation, but I think we always end up with the same truth at the end. We don't really have a dog in the fight, and we feel so bad for those who are caught in the middle.
Right.
And the pity seems to be that, correct me if I'm wrong, Your Excellency, but my impression from Father Valery is that living in the eastern Ukraine, there was no real day-to-day conflict between those who had a Ukrainian background, like himself, and those who had a Russian background who ended up in the Ukraine. But it's only when it became a war between empires that all of a sudden there was a conflict.
It was actually
and it was one created.
It was a post-Soviet society. That is to say that religion was almost dead, and people and their spirit, their hopes were almost dead. They were all materialists themselves in one sense or another, and it was either Russian Orthodox or else Protestant. American Protestants that had the field there, and no one was interested in genuine Catholicism, that's for sure. And then but what Nicholas said earlier intrigues me from an American point of view. There of course there's this tremendous wellspring of shall we say, anti-Russian, anti-Putin feeling in America that can be appealed to. Everybody from he's a Canadian priest, isn't he? You know, the head of the Fatima industry was always pounding on that stuff.
Oh, Father Gruner.
Father Gruner, and everything from him to just those who remember growing up in the Cold War, and Russian equals communist equals bad. So these are just ways that people get manipulated and behind tags or titles or things like that. But if we have time, so Nicholas, there's one thing that we didn't cover, if we're talking about the news roundup of the summer, we should speak a little bit about the role of the fate of Christians in the Middle East, because in a sense, we do have certainly a dog in this fight, and this whole rise of ISIS and these media savvy Mohammedans who are beheading people and then sending the video out to people for their entertainment.
We certainly do have time for that. But forgive me, Lord, but could I just put one last thought out there on the Russia question before we change gears and go to that? Because we've talked a little bit of, some people might say almost pro-Russian kind of stuff, or I think just trying to balance things out a bit. But one thing I would just like to hasten to add, though, is, again, we don't have a dog in the fight. We're not saying this means Russia are the good guys. And the reason I would like to point that out specifically is, I don't know about Your Lordship and Father's experience, but I personally know a number of traditional Catholics who've been almost seduced by Russian Orthodoxy and by the Russians. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of traditional Catholics have developed this idealized vision of Russia because they say, oh, well, look, in Russia, some pop or punk rockers desecrated one of their cathedrals and they threw them in jail. So, look, these guys are they're serious about this, and they passed some law that sodomites aren't allowed to have parades in Moscow. So I've actually known some traditional Catholics who've thought of moving to Russia, and I know more than one who have actually apostatized, left the faith for Russian Orthodoxy because of this romantic, idealized view. And so I just want to quickly ask for your comments on that, just to kind of underscore that is absolutely not a solution. And really, part of my family is Russian background. Now, they were Catholics living in Western Russia, so they obviously had a certain perspective. But from what I've always heard from them is, I mean, Russian Orthodoxy, you talked about the Caesaropapism. I mean, it's like the Anglican Church almost. It's just like this state religion that's just there to prop up the government, really. And in terms of any real spiritual authority, it's rather a joke.
And the only real spiritual impetus or real spiritual life or anything approaching that you'll get in any of these schismatic sects is actually from the converts, from those who get in. Then they might find a few kindred spirits who want to develop these themes. But the reality is it's a national church that serves the purposes of the current rulers of the day, and that speaks an awful lot. But talk about your different perceptions of Russia. This has always intrigued and fascinated me to consider that the French traditional Catholics, as a rule, have a great reverence for not only Russia as opposed to America, but also for Putin, because Putin as a leader is publicly attending church, the Russian Orthodox services from time to time, and as seen supposedly wears a cross, and actually venerated some of the relics of the Passion of our Lord when he visited Paris a number of years ago, Notre Dame, and in sort of an official capacity. And for the French, who are always yearning for that, the marriage of church and state and the monarchy and all those wonderful old ideals, this was very, very telling for them. So you have that French perspective. The Russians are good because they're for the old values, and they've got almost a monarchy again, and they've got this strong church, and it's all reverent and respectful. And then you have then those who are from the post-Soviet era, Americans say, who have a strong anti-Russian prejudice in effect. How interesting! But as you say, from the spiritual point of view, that's just dead. That's a dead end street. There isn't any. It's what Dom Guéranger a long time ago called a withered branch on the body of the church. The schismatic sect that the Russian Orthodox Church. There's no life there. There's no possible spiritual life there. The church has the answers, and if people go to that, it's because they've never actually studied what the Catholic Church teaches, and they never submitted themselves to her magisterium or teaching authority. You always get down to the problem of authority. I think that's what it is, and they've never understood properly the subversion of authority in the church because of the false popes of Vatican II and all this whole. It's all a question of authority. It's Caesaropapism, for example. And the Catholic Church, the question of sedevacantist, that's always the elephant in the room. I think you have to talk about it. Perhaps that's how these people allow themselves to be seduced, Nicholas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it may be. And I know some of the people I knew, well, a couple of them were sedevacantists, and I guess some people, they didn't study enough of, I don't know exactly what went on, but this, I guess, scandalized by the situation in the church, they saw this as a way out. I think God knows, but it seems that it's kind of an easy way out to just say, well, hey, look, maybe the Orthodox are right all along because they seem strong and robust right now, ignoring the fact that they were controlled by the KGB for almost 100 years.
Yes, and in fact, Father Valery maintains, and many do, that Kirill, the Patriarch of Moscow, he is a former KGB agent. That's a fact. So he's not a believer at all. It's all just it's an elaborate act, and it looks good. If we've got pope problems in Catholicism, they've never had a pope. Well, actually, they did have a pope. The pope is always whoever has the power in Russia. He is the one who is infallible, and he is the one who has to be obeyed. And everything else is just wonderful props from an opera, like Boris Godunov, something like that. It looks great, sounds wonderful, very, very moving. It appeals to the senses, but there's no substance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps now's a good time to change gears. And, my Lord, I know you wanted to speak about the plight of Christians in the Holy Land, and that being a situation where perhaps we do have a dog in the fight, and the rise of ISIS and these terrorists in the Middle East.
Yes, because I think that obviously it's a tragedy to consider, and it's very, very moving to consider even the people who are dissidents themselves, who are schismatics or even heretics in these different, like the Syrian church, for example, nevertheless, who kept so much of Christianity and even the devotion, as Pius XII said to our Blessed Mother, the Mother of God, that they should be driven out of their homes because of their faith, because they refuse to apostatize, sometimes themselves and their children brutally beheaded, and all of the rest. And it's edifying to consider the sacrifices that these Christians in the Middle East are willing to make because of their faith, because of our Lord. It's a very, very edifying thing, and we should draw some sort of strength and also maybe be reproached by that, I think, a little bit. But the essential matter to consider here, to get a hold on what's happening with all this ISIS and beheading business. The United States set up and trained these people through the Mujahideen and all the rest of it. They armed these people directly and indirectly, as did the Saudis. Then, because we wanted to engage in yet another regime change, because we're the empire and we'll declare that. So the ruler, Assad, the ruler of Syria, had to go, as Hussein, the ruler of Iraq, had to go, and different rulers of Iran in the past, or Libya, all these regime changes that we manipulate and run. Well, so then they're so successful in Syria that they spread over into the anarchy of Iraq after the American troops have withdrawn. And of course, when given a chance, if they're not busy killing each other, they're equal opportunity killers. They're going to kill Christians. They hate Christians. It's a bit like the Holy Land. The Jews hate the Christians, and they would persecute them tomorrow if they could. And the Mohammedans hate the Christians. And it's the same thing. If they were not busy killing each other, they would turn on, as they have from time to time, directly and indirectly, on the Christians. So it's who's responsible for the draining of Christians from the Middle East, for their persecution, for their murder? The United States is. The United States government. We set up this Mujahideen. We set up all these wars. The dictators, for all of their faults, and of course, obviously, no one could give a brief in their favor, but for all their faults, they maintained a political stability. And the dictators in these lands, Iraq particularly, and in Syria, protected the Christian minority. They protected them. They considered them loyal, and they were always safe from the crazy, marauding Mohammedans. We destroyed that. We destroyed that. And now this is the result of it. Christians have to flee their own home, and many of them have suffered so very much this summer, this year, and will continue to suffer more. And that is your American tax dollars at work.
The question of the extension of the empires, and that those who we've used as tools fighting, say, another empire, turn around and use the weapons that we have given them against us. That is, in fact, what happened with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that the Americans armed them against the Soviets. And eventually, when the Soviet influence was lost there, Afghanistan turned around and became a base for Al-Qaeda, which we know how that one ended. And so too in Iraq, the arming of these different factions and the destruction of the dictators there as part of a way of expanding our own empires was turned against us, and eventually turned against Christianity as well. Mm-hmm. You see what a terrible effect this desire for empire, the export of empire, has.
Well, I mean, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. It's written right into the Quran that I can't remember the exact quote. It's been a little while since I've studied that, but it's right in there that it's good to kill the infidel and to kill the Christians. I mean, that's their ticket to heaven and all their, quote, heaven, unquote, and all the sensual earthly pleasures that they believe they'll enjoy there. But in terms of using these people, do you think this is naivete on the part of the empire builders, that they didn't read that part of the Quran, so they don't realize that these guys will turn around on them later? Is it indifference, or is it really evil genius forward thinking of, hey, we can use them to break down our enemy, but then they can attack us so that we can have an excuse to wage another war?
I think one is very tempted in the case of 42, George W. Bush and his minder, the Halliburton executive Cheney. One's very tempted to say that they had no idea, they had no interest, and they had no idea, and they simply went into this war for their own purposes, and they didn't care. But I don't think that you could say that about Hussein Obama, our current president. He's a rather well-read and intelligent man, and obviously he has the Muslim background to boot. I think that's another story there. But be that as it may, this is the result. This is the result of regime change. We set if reporters are having their heads chopped off, and if Christians are being driven from their homes and put to death, we paid for that and we set that up. Mm-hmm. We should have seen it coming.
Now, in terms of the beheading of these journalists, I think that goes back to a bit about something that your Lordship mentioned early in the show about the people in the Middle East. Well, they hate Christians, but they hate the American empire not so much because they hate freedom and democracy, mm-hmm. but they hate it because of all the meddling that the empire does in their part of the world. And I believe that the person who beheaded these reporters, that he in his video, he in fact said, like, he kind of called out the American foreign policy and this meddling as his reason for doing this, didn't he?
You know, I didn't actually listen to it or follow that too closely. Did you, Father?
No, I didn't. But I mean, that's always the subtext. The subtext is that we are that these different actions are being undertaken against American citizens because of American meddling, mm-hmm. and that is that seems to be a constant theme. I mean, I remember myself on 9/11, first hearing about this on the radio about the towers being hit, and the first thing that occurred to me before anyone made any statement is that it's U.S. Mideast policy, and this is a revenge for it, and this is now what we get for meddling in all of these foreign countries, and now we're being attacked for it. Mm-hmm. And I think that sorry, that was very much that was the propaganda that, and very much the line that the Al-Qaeda people took. That it was because of this. It's because we keep on getting involved in unjust wars and meddling in other people's affairs that we end up suffering the consequences one way or another ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Father, I actually pulled up a bit of a transcript of the video from the beheading of one of the journalists, Stephen Sotloff, and apparently mm-hmm. the before beheading him, the Mohammedans said, quote, "We take this opportunity to warn those governments that enter into this evil alliance of America against the Islamic State to back off and leave our people alone," unquote.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's explicit, although it's ironic on the other hand, though, because how could he possibly think that by beheading this a bound, kneeling man, how could he think that would have any effect other than to have Obama order to drop more bombs on the Middle East?
Yeah, of course. But then, if you're a fanatic, you're a fanatic, and there are other fanatics on both sides, and they're essentially, it will be played according to the script. One suspects sometimes the script has already been written and produced, and we're just supposed to read our lines.
Mm-hmm. But it would seem that taking out these dictators and specifically taking out Saddam Hussein, who I believe the Americans had actually set up in the first place. Another example
of course,
that's really had the effect of kind of kicking the hornet's nest in the Middle East, because now you mentioned all these Islamic groups are coming up, and Saddam Hussein was really an atheist, secular strongman. He wasn't a Mohammedan fanatic, and
no, not at all.
If you have to choose, I think the atheist strongman is preferable to these guys.
It's a strong argument in favor of, in effect, a very strong empire. We say about the effects of World War I that it destroyed the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the last Catholic monarchy. Let us note in passing. What that empire did was to maintain in peace all of these different subjected peoples and nations, little nation states, all these different cultures, by a strong centralized government. You take that away, and then what do they do right away? Well, they start killing each other with great glee. The Bosnians go after the Herzegovinians, and the Croatians get involved, and the Dalmatians, and everybody kills everybody else to settle all these ancient feuds, which are so many of them, of course, based on religion and apostasy and invasion. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire maintained peace. Saddam Hussein, he maintained peace because of his very, very strong hand. And when you look at the utter fanaticism of these caliphate people, you have to say, of course there was something to that. That was actually a good era for them. And maybe that's, especially in the agitated world of the Mohammedan resurgence, maybe that's really the best that one could have hoped for. But now, having disturbed, as you say, the hornet's nest, all the bugs are all out now, and they're biting everybody.
But if we were to say these things in polite company, I think the reaction that people would get would show how much the propaganda that we've been discussing today has impacted people, and how deeply it's influenced people, because a lot of people would be aghast to hear these things. And I think even an American congressman, Ron Paul, I think he brought up the American meddling.
Oh, yeah, he says a lot of good things.
These things, and he was booed by his fellows in the Congress.
Yeah,
and that
absolutely.
Shows how deep of a hold this propaganda has.
Veritas odium paret, St. Augustine told us the other day for the beheading of St. John the Baptist. Truth gives birth to hatred, and that's ever the way. You say mentioning these things, Nicholas, in polite company. If you even mention it in impolite company, that is to say traditional Catholic circles, you could get into terrific trouble. I mean, you have the benefit of the pulpit microphone system and the fact that most Catholics are, of course, very respectful during the Holy Mass and the sermon, but that's not going to control what's said afterwards or what's said in private. No, even in traditional Catholic circles, a lot of this would be just be shocking. It would just be it would be unbelievable. How can you say these things? You can't be right.
Right. And to listeners who might react that way to the show, I would say, well, go do some reading and research, and I think you'll see that it backs up what we're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Turn off Fox News, and maybe look up something else. Look up some good books, some good history.
Or just access some of the websites today that might be available to give you another perspective on these current events. It's entertaining. It's fascinating. It's food for the mind. It's not at all a slog through it, as propaganda always is. No, this is you should. As Dan Quayle used to say, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. So I think we should all believe in that, carry that on. I wanted to mention, if I may, one interesting quote on this ISIS question, that the United States government, for all of the bravado and the bombing and the talk of bombing and maybe sending troops on the ground, the United States government's greatest fear isn't ISIS at all. The FBI, which is, of course, our foremost anti-terrorist agency, supposedly, the FBI's recent threat assessment for domestic terrorism doesn't make any reference at all, because of political correctness, to Islamic terror threats. Despite the supposed story of the Boston Marathon bombing, the Fort Hood shooting, those were carried out by radical Muslims. No, the greatest domestic threat is domestic extremism exhibited by America's own subjects. And the primary manifestation of this kind of extremism is exactly what I'm urging people. We are urging people to do this today on this show, on this presentation, is to possess. This is a quote from one writer in particular, to possess the curiosity to discern and to seek out truth and information amidst the barrage of manipulated symbols again, the government and corporate controlled media used to undermine a potentially informed republic. We should inform ourselves. And if the government considers that to be a threat, that's an interesting reaction.
And on that note, my lord, I hope that our listeners from the National Security Agency are enjoying the show.
And the Southern Poverty Law Center and everybody else. I hope they are. Well, of course, now at least these people are going to have to ante up, right? They got to pay their nickel if they want to hear the rest of the outrage from us. Unless they use the NCIS spying agency to get a free listen to the Restoration Radio Network, because it's only free now for the first 15 minutes. After that, you got to pay.
Lord and Father, I don't know how much longer you have to say, but if you have a few more minutes, I wonder if we could just touch really briefly on going back, kind of circling back to the Michael Brown thing. We're talking about black culture and that. And one thing that Your Lordship mentioned earlier in the show that I wanted to comment on, but we got onto too many other interesting topics. They're talking about the superfluous father, the matriarchy that's grown up, and the kind of the killing with kindness that the American government has done to black people. And same thing's been done up here in Canada to the Red Indians or Aboriginals or First Nations, whatever it's politically correct to call them this week, where they're just given these handouts, and that just further destroys the family structure. And they're just going back to that. I think there was an interesting comment, one of the articles Father Cekada sent me about, there was one, I think, a famous comedian or actor who's of African-American descent, was saying that if he could change one thing about black culture, it'd be the uniformity of it. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's a sense of loyalty. Because they're built. It's built upon a sense of grievance. It's us versus them. It's those bad people, whitey, the bad white people, or the government, or whatever, who persecute us. We're all poor, and we're all in it together. And they use that to police their own people. And sometimes they do indeed police themselves. But I think, as that article points out, at least in private, they are actually they know what the truth is. And sometimes people in private will dare to say the truth. But it takes a risk. It takes a risk. And I think the article points out that they wouldn't do it in the presence of white people because that would not be well received or politically correct. It would be viewed as disloyal. But saying the truth can never be disloyal. It always has to be a very first step towards getting at the root of things and getting things straightened out again. You have to say the truth, and you must be discreet, of course, but you don't have to be afraid of it. But these are people who are all, for all of the anarchy of their neighborhoods and their life, their society, utter anarchy because of drugs and all that government money floating around and no family structure anymore. They police themselves, and I think that's an interesting point, Nicholas. I think the government has that as a goal. They want us to police ourselves, just as say that the Jews did in the Warsaw Ghetto for the Nazis. And they don't, keep your mouth shut and go along and wear the uniform and don't make trouble. And if you do, then you're disloyal to everybody else in your subgroup. But I don't think that we need to be doing the bad guys' work for them. And there are a few excellent black writers who point that out constantly. But it's a cultural thing, isn't it? And then people are now culturally conditioned just because they have their enemy and they have their secrets. And I suppose that's their life.
And I think the homogeneity of culture I found really interesting. I think to an extent that's occurring with everyone, really. On the one hand, we have, quote, multiculturalism, unquote. But on the other hand, we really have, there is a lot of self-policing. We were already talking about that earlier in the show, of the reactions that we would get for making some of the comments that we've made on this show in polite or even impolite company, and how that peer pressure would have a way of self-correction among a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Yes, and you see that uniformity again very much because of the influence of the media, the politically correct line, and so on. And as far as blacks policing themselves, you very much get that impression in terms of the culture, the way the kids dress, what is considered correct among the black youth, that the mode of dress for so many of the black kids is something that is enforced by the popular standards of their own individual culture, and it unfortunately goes back to the criminals, to criminal culture, which has been made, prison, that has been made sort of popular. That these were the tough guys in the ghetto who wore the pants that drooped down because they had lost weight when they were in prison, and this was considered something that showed that you were really a tough guy. So this became part of the popular culture, and
a badge of honor.
Is idealized, and if you don't conform to that, you're punished. Or if your manner of speaking English is grammatically incorrect, then you are, or rather is, if you try to be grammatically correct, then you are stigmatized as trying to act white, when in fact you're simply trying to speak the English language properly. So there are all of these things that you can't do.
And the whole world of corruption too, right? Look at all politicians and they're on a local level. I think of Cincinnati city government, for example, the immense, all the deals and all the corruption and all the money, and then the great black and white too, TV preachers, all the money and all the luxuries that they have amassed for themselves. And the other poor people are supposed to just pay up and shut up. And they're supposed to believe the propaganda that their preachers or their politicians force feed them and just sort of accept them. No wonder they, in such a soulless society without a family, they find refuge in drugs. How very sad. No one has ever offered them anything near a solution. Everyone just takes advantage of them and uses them.
And I think that the clothing that Father pointed out in the music, those are very important parts to this forcing conformity upon people. And among the black youth, they have to listen to rap music, and they'll be derided. I mean, heaven forbid if there were someone who liked classical music, he'd probably get beaten up in the schoolyard every day, and he has to dress that certain way. And again, it's the same among everyone. I mean, it's the same with white people as well. I mean, I know for myself, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I mean, you could only listen to rock music, otherwise you're a social outcast, and you have to dress a certain way. So the bad old days, quote unquote, are derided for people being forced to conform, but really they had more variety of culture then than now, where there's just one type of music. Everyone has to wear jeans and t-shirt. You're not allowed to wear anything else, and it has to be certain approved logos on the t-shirt.
Yes, a dress code. There's we have a strict dress code, but ours is nothing like their dress code. You're right. But the one advantage of this, as we're just sort of musing on these social themes, Nicholas, is that on the other hand, I don't know what your adolescence was like, but it offers our youth the opportunity to rebel, because that almost seems to be something in the adolescent gene, right? You have to rebel. But you can rebel against the bad guys. You can rebel against the lies and the nonsense and the foolishness. I willingly admit I was certainly a rebel in the 1960s, which is a great era of revolution. But I rebelled against the Novus Ordo Church and the New Mass and the whole program of modernism in Catholicism. So there is a good side to this. There is a good side to this, I think, in some very maybe indirect sense. And by means of harnessing that natural impulse, which of course is disordered to start with, but there you have it. You can maybe appeal to youth today. You don't have to be enslaved by all of this. You don't have to. There's something else. Show a little courage. Be a rebel. Speak up.
Right. Well, one final news story that I'd like to squeeze in here that's been pretty big, I think, in American news is about the border to the south with Mexico. We've mentioned Mexico earlier, and we've just mentioned immigration and multiculturalism tangentially, and talking about the Black culture. But this summer, there's been this open borders issue that's becoming a big problem, and I wonder if we could just speak a little bit from a Catholic perspective about that, since there's thousands upon thousands of illegal immigrants coming across the American border from Mexico. First of all, I guess it's sort of, who are the puppet masters behind this, and to what end are they encouraging all this mass illegal immigration into the United States?
That's an interesting issue, and I tend to think it's also going to be one of those things where you see so much wrong on both sides. Mm-hmm. You have to consider how the plutocracy in Mexico, in union now with the American capitalists and big government, have destroyed especially since that trade agreement about 20 years ago, really has destroyed so much of Mexican economy. And so these poor people, fathers of families, or would-be fathers of families, who have, after all, a natural right to be able to support their families, find that there's nothing else that they can do for a future than to illegally to enter the United States, get themselves smuggled across, and then attempt to work. The trouble is that when they leave their homes and their villages and the rest, whatever remnants they had of religion and very often of morality, with the exception of some strong family values that seem to perdure, those things tend to go. That's always a tragedy of immigration. And obviously, for a lot of this talk about immigration and borders and the rest of it is fueled by a certain racial prejudice. Maybe it's because I've known so many Mexicans and I've worked in Mexico for so many years myself now as a missionary bishop that I tend to find I have great sympathy for them. But it is a complex issue, and it has an economic side. And you can see the puppet masters, the bad guys, wanting to create this one world society again with the open borders and the rest of it. I don't know, Father Cekada, what do you think?
Yeah, as you say, it is a complex issue, and you do feel very sympathetic toward the people who do live in poverty. On the other hand, you can see from the point of view of American socialist politics that the idea is that this is an issue to be manipulated by politicians on both sides of the aisle. The Democratic Party wants to manipulate it, the immigration issue, in such a way to use it to their advantage so that they can acquire more adherence to the Democratic Party. On the other hand, the Republicans want to wave the flag of American nationalism, etc. So they use that for their own purposes. So you can see from the point of view of American politicians how it is being manipulated. Then actually having dealt with the United States immigration system, I can tell you that it's an absolute mess. You can, because to come and to work in this country legally, the bureaucracy makes it so difficult for you to do this. You have to have a lot of money, and it can cost you as much as $5,000 to get someone into the United States legally. So there's this enormous government bureaucracy. And my impression, at least with Mexicans, is that they, in many cases, simply do not want to live in the United States permanently. They simply want to come and earn some money and then go back home, because that is their culture. That's what they're interested in. But the laws in the United States make it so difficult for them to do this that many of them do have to come here illegally. So it is complex.
Their danger is that if they come here, that their children become Americanized and addicted to coke and everything else, and then they want to stay in what they would consider to be blindly the good life, rather than send the money back and start a family, buy a house, build a house, have a fiesta, get the kids baptized, get married in the church, whatever it is, and have some big fiestas, because that's so much part of their culture. So that's the danger of these relatively innocent people on some level coming to our country and getting perverted, because America exports perversion and America lives perversion. We don't see it because we've lived with it. We breathed it in all of our lives. But you see the effect of it on these other more innocent native peoples. Oh my goodness, it's a shameful and a really terrible thing. So it's a complicated issue. Yeah.
Right. On the flip side, is there an issue in justice for American citizens who are losing jobs, perhaps, because since the immigrants are illegal, they can't command the same type of salary that a legal citizen would, and that therefore people are losing jobs?
I think that gets us into another issue, because our corrupt Congress and its laws have managed to destroy the American middle class, and so that there's this wide and astounding income disparity now, whereby we've turned into a country that primarily ends up with people in low-paying service jobs. So I don't think that from the point of view of Mexicans or immigrants, that is making too much difference. And, most American kids are too spoiled to go and pick grapes. At least the Mexicans, your illegal immigrants, are willing to do hard physical labor. So again, it's an extremely complex issue, but I don't think that it's really a question of job loss or anything like that. I think it gets us into another problem of the decline of American society because of the corruption in our political system.
Well,
we have the best
Father,
Congress that money can buy.
Yeah,
right.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I know, Lord and Father, you both have busy days ahead of you, and you have other duties to attend to, so I don't want to keep you much longer, but thank you for indulging me in my questions and a few things I wanted to talk about near the end there. But before we wrap up, was there anything that either of you wanted to touch on before we close?
I think probably just to stress this idea, what Father Cekada mentioned about the just wage. This too is unknown. These are all the great unknown truths of Catholicism. The Church has a social teaching. Employees have rights. Employers have duties, and vice versa. It's like husband and wife. And these things had never been taught or explained. The immense possibilities there for a just society have never been exploited, as much because of Western capitalists who would be then, believing and praying Republicans, as it were, as by the communists or the socialists. So it's our duty to not only to get an quiet, impassive reflection on the truth, to get at the truth, to get that out, but then to get out the Catholic Church teaching. The Kingship of Christ embraces every aspect of life and of society. And so therefore, there's nothing that we talked about today that doesn't directly or indirectly touch religion. And if that's the one message that I could get out, I would get it out. And if your priest gives a sermon or publishes something on these points, you should encourage him to do so. You should spread it around to others and talk it up, because this is a great, often neglected, but very important work.
And I would develop that just this way, or in this sense, that find out what the Catholic principles are, and learn to stand aside from the society and the culture in which you live, with many problems it has, in order to see everything around you from a Catholic perspective. And that would be the first point I would make. And the second point I would make would be to the folks in the Southern Poverty Law Center that I hope you at least have enough money, you're not so poor, that you can't afford to support Restoration Radio.
Because you get a lot of fodder here.
Let's redistribute some of the wealth toward us, okay?
Right.
All right. Well, my Lord and Father, thank you very much for a fantastic and fascinating couple hours. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think it'll give our listeners an awful lot of food for thought. And to our listeners, I also encourage you for further study. One place you can look at is sggresources.org. That's a website run by Father Cekada, and it has all kinds of things on it. It has a link to Father Cekada's blog, has a link to Bishop Dolan's newsletter, has a number of important articles, the St. Gertrude the Great Bulletin, and numerous other things that you can, just some things like some good music that you can purchase, and things of that nature. So I encourage listeners to check out sggresources.org. And if you'd like to contact the bishop or father to give them a note of thanks for the work they do, or to ask them a question on something we've discussed, you can reach them at St. Gertrude the Great Church, 4900 Rialto Road. That's 4900 RALTO Road, Westchester, Ohio. 45069 is the zip code. Again, 45069. So with that, then I'll let your Lordship and Father get back to your full day and your other duties and work that you have. And thanks you once again for joining me for an excellent episode of Clerical Conversations on the Crisis on the Restoration Radio Network.
Nicholas, I would just add that it's always a pleasure to be here with you, and this has been a very interesting show. If the rules of capitalism, i.e. the financial support, dictate that this has been an interesting topic for people, I would suggest that from time to time we take time simply to discuss current events in the light of the Kingship of Christ. I think it could be I think we could be onto something here for Restoration Radio, and it could actually be very, very helpful. So let's keep it in mind for future programming too.
Sure. Certainly, absolutely.
Very good. Well, thank you for having Father and myself, and we look forward to the next Clerical Conversations. God bless you.
God bless you all.
Thank you. So, listeners, if you have any questions or some show topic suggestions, you can reach me and the Clerical Conversations on the Crisis crew at clerical@truerestoration.org. That's CLERICAL @truerestoration.org. And all of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask that if you found this show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and your faith, that you please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help to make our network worthwhile. And remember that above and beyond material contributions, such as purchasing this show a la carte or taking out a subscription, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. So please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even a simple Ave for our work the next time you pray. So for the Restoration, I'm Nicholas Wanswetter. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.